Hello, everybody. I am Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. It is so good to be with you guys today. This is our National HoUSed campaign call. I'm just going to go ahead and get started since we had a little bit of a hiccup and started a couple minutes late. But just as a reminder, our National HoUSed campaign, we started it in 2021 to focus on advancing the anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale investments that we need to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable, accessible place to call home. And we launched this campaign because we recognize that more than ever, we need really bold policy solutions to make sure that the lowest income and most marginalized people have access to housing. So on our call today, we have advocates from across the country. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. We have folks who work on homelessness, whether shelter or service providers. We have housing providers, housing advocates. We have resident organizers on the call, people with lived experience, including those in need of or receiving federal housing assistance. We have philanthropy, and we have media on the call. So a really broad array of stakeholders with us. For today's call, we're going to hear some really important updates. One, we're going to hear about a new opportunity to engage on federal renter protections with the Federal Housing Finance Agency. We're going to talk about some pressing, very important, very urgent developments when it comes to threats to the HUD housing budget and other key programs. We're going to hear from experts from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We're going to hear from the Legal Aid Society of New York about the New York City mayor, who has been calling for increased criminalization of people experiencing homelessness and forced hospitalization. And then we'll hear updates from Idaho and New Jersey about some great work that they're doing there. Before we jump into the agenda, though, I just want to remind everybody that you can ask questions in the Q&A box. It's a little bit easier for us to follow than if you put it in the chat box, so just keep that in mind. And we'll try to get to as many questions that we can. And then we will be sure to share with everybody a copy of the PowerPoint, a copy of the recording of this presentation, and any of the materials that our presenters reference. We'll share that all with you guys after the call. So let's get right into it. I'm going to turn over the mic to Siobhan Kelly, who is with the Federal Housing Finance Agency, who's going to talk to us about opportunities to engage on federal renter protections. Thanks, Siobhan.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, thank you to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for having me here today. I truly appreciate you taking the time to invite me to what I believe is a very timely conversation on FHFA's evaluation of multifamily tenant protections at enterprise-backed properties. As Sarah said, my name is Siobhan Kelly. I lead the Federal Housing Finance Agency's Office of Multifamily Analytics and Policy, otherwise known as OMAP. So OMAP is a relatively new office at FHFA. It's focused solely on multifamily and was part of several changes led by Director Thompson that are taking place at the agency to boost research and supervisory activities. Director Thompson has said on numerous occasions that FHFA's work stands on the twin pillars of good lending, sustainability, and affordability. And each of these pillars is necessary for safe, sound, and effective financing, and each strengthens the other. After all, a loan that a borrower cannot afford is unsustainable. It will stop performing. One way Director Thompson has sought to ensure the twin pillars of good lending is by dedicating an entire team to focus on multifamily issues. Over the past 3 years, OMAP has streamlined FHFA's oversight and monitoring for all multifamily policies, programs, products, and procedures, and this has allowed us to be nimbler and more responsive. Our office also serves as FHFA's multifamily voice and provides insight and expertise to the other divisions across the agency. Now, as Sarah mentioned, I plan to share with you some of OMAP's top priorities relating to multifamily tenant protections in 2023. And listening in today are 4 of my team members, Lauren Enrico, Kenny Maribel, Mary Baer, and Mary Owens, and I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge them and all of their hard work on this initiative, because they are the ones who are truly leading this important work. So FHFA is committed to ensuring that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the enterprises, operate in a safe and sound manner while also promoting equitable access to affordable and sustainable housing. The enterprises can play a role as industry leaders in identifying solutions for addressing the challenges renters are facing nationwide, particularly among underserved communities. This year, the enterprises were asked to develop and implement strategies to explore the feasibility of expanding tenant protections in properties financed by the enterprises. FHFA's determination to evaluate the enterprise's tenant standards is based on lessons learned from COVID-19, surging rent prices, and a lack of safe and affordable housing in America. FHFA's determination to evaluate the enterprise's tenant standards is based, as I said, on a lot of lessons learned. On January 4th, FHFA released the 2023 scorecard for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, each year we release an annual scorecard to communicate and provide public awareness of our priorities and expectations for the enterprises. So it's really our version of a report card for them. In the agency's 2023 scorecard, FHFA instructed the enterprises to explore the feasibility of expanding tenant protections for properties with enterprise-backed mortgages and to identify strategies and activities that would facilitate a greater amount of affordable rental housing supply. FHFA will continue to evaluate the enterprise's role in providing tenant protections and advancing affordable housing opportunities for those in need. Now, many people on this phone call probably recognize that the White House published the blueprint for a renter's Bill of Rights, which included a commitment by FHFA to establish a process to, quote, engage with stakeholders to identify opportunities and challenges of adopting and enforcing tenant protections. With policies that limit excessive rent increases at properties with enterprise-backed loans. FHFA will lead this transparent stakeholder engagement process over the next year to explore the enterprise's role in protecting the nation's tenants. On April 13th, we announced that as part of FHFA's engagement process, we are going to be seeking public input in May, which is right around the corner. We're in May right now. We're hoping to get this out by the end of the month on opportunities and potential impacts associated with requiring or incentivizing specific tenant protections at multifamily properties backed by the enterprises. Now, there's obviously been an increased focus from the Biden administration on the need for enhanced tenant protections, and an FHFA is an independent agency. However, we are voluntary participants on the White House Tenant Protection Interagency Policy Committee. Our mission is to promote equitable access to affordable and sustainable housing by ensuring that all borrowers and renters, including those in underserved communities, have access to safe, decent, and affordable housing opportunities. But I think it is important to highlight that the enterprise have a public mission to promote equitable solutions for borrowers and tenants in the multifamily housing market. The enterprises can play a role as industry leaders by identifying solutions for addressing these challenges that renters are facing nationwide, particularly in those underserved communities. And one example of this is Freddie Mac's recent paper on tenant protections, which provides an unprecedented look at available tenant protections across the country. So if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you all to check it out on Freddie Mac's webpage. No federal agency has authority to regulate ownership or operation of real estate owned by the private sector. So such research is invaluable because most of the regulation of tenants' rights and landlords' obligations occurs at the state or local level. Now, one of the big questions we're getting around this topic is why. So why is FHFA issuing an RFI on tenant protections at enterprise-backed properties? As I stated earlier, we recognize that many renters can be exploited by housing providers who either do not abide by the law or their lease agreements or take advantage of opportunities created by a lack of legal constraints. If such an exploitation occurs, tenants often have little recourse or ability to exercise their housing rights. These circumstances often result in the loss of tenants' housing. The purpose of the RFI is for FHFA to receive feedback from a diverse set of viewpoints, like many of you on this call, on issues related to multifamily tenant protections. Our primary goals are, number one, to collect information from tenant advocates, nonprofits, lenders, multifamily borrowers, housing providers, government officials, mortgage industry groups, and people with lived experience to explore perspectives, as well as identify opportunities and challenges to address issues tenants are facing at multifamily properties. We also want to identify opportunities for the industry to improve data collection to better quantify the size and scope of this problem, because I think, as everybody knows, there's not really a lot of data available currently. The second question we often get is, what are FHFA's plan to examine the, quote, limits on egregious rent increases? And that was a direct quote from the White House's paper. FHFA recognizes that housing affordability is a major concern, and FHFA is conducting outreach, including exploring ways to support affordable rental housing. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were created by Congress to perform an important role in the nation's housing finance system, to provide liquidity, stability, and affordability to the mortgage market in a safe and sound manner. Because of the vital role of the enterprises play in providing liquidity in the mortgage market, particularly in affordable housing, FHFA takes a holistic view when considering any policy changes and identifies the foreseeable effects of any change on how our regulated entities manage and reduce risk on housing affordability, on fair lending, and unquestionably on health and safety concerns. We are planning to conduct a public process and will consult with experts on tenant protections and rent increases. Part of this process around tenant protections FHFA is committed to includes exploring what constitutes, quote, egregious when we talk about rent increases. Without further action from Congress, enforcement of landlord and tenant laws is a province of the state, not FHFA, although the enterprises can and will enforce loan agreements upon learning of a failure to comply with state law or the terms of the loan agreement. Now, while FHFA does not have enforcement authority over the landlord or tenant agreements, we think it is important to explore actions that FHFA can take to promote housing stability for tenants living in enterprise-backed properties. Ultimately, the enterprises are responsible for financing rather than operating multifamily properties. As lenders, they are constrained by the risk of an adverse legal consequences that could result from interference with the borrower's, i.e. the landlord's, business. Thus, FHFA must also balance the need for tenant protections with its mandate to ensure the safety and soundness of the enterprises, which depends on the ability of landlord borrowers to repay their loans. FHFA's efforts will ensure future initiatives by the enterprises will continue to be informed by data analysis, diverse viewpoints, and the best practices in the multifamily market. This is an open invitation to all stakeholders on this call to help us shape these policies through participation in this process. Now, I want to highlight some of the work FHFA has already done in terms of tenant protections, starting with manufactured housing communities, MHCs. The duty to serve statute and regulation includes manufactured housing as an eligible activity. Under this activity, the enterprises may finance manufactured housing communities where the owner has agreed to implement 8 tenant protections related to the pad lease for the land underneath the manufactured housing unit. Those protections include renewable lease terms, advance notice of rental payment increases, or sale of a manufactured housing community, and rights regarding the sale of their manufactured homes. FHFA has established monitoring and reporting requirements to ensure that the protections have been implemented, including an annual written certification by the MHC borrower that it has applied the protections, and an annual audit of executed written leases or rules and regulations by the lender or servicer. We've also implemented a 30-day notice requirement. So FHFA interpreted the CARES Act 4024C1 to permanently require 30 days notice prior to a tenant being forced to vacate a rental unit. Therefore, landlords whose financing is backed by an enterprise are still obligated indefinitely to provide a 30-day notice to vacate for all such properties. The 30-day notice requirement overrides all state and local landlord tenant law regarding notices for properties covered by the CARES Act. And we announced this policy back in July of 2021. We also have some COVID-19 related tenant protections. So tenants may be protected from eviction from rental properties under the CARES Act for tenants of multifamily properties in forbearance. And that's a program that allows the property owner to delay their mortgage payment and or state or local eviction moratorium and rules. For enterprise-backed mortgages in forbearance, property owners are not permitted to 1, charge late fees or penalties for back rent, and 2, require past due rent to be repaid in a lump sum, and 3, evict any tenant solely on the basis of their inability to pay rent. On August 4th of 2020, FHFA also directed the enterprises to require those multifamily property owners with a new or modified forbearance agreement to inform tenants of their available protections during the forbearance and repayment periods. Lastly, the big thing that we did too was direct the enterprises to create property lookup tools that enable tenants to access information on any enterprise-backed properties. Although these tools were created as part of FHFA's COVID-19 response, they will remain available indefinitely. Now, in terms of enforcement within the context of FHFA and the enterprises, one of the frequent questions we get is if attorneys or advocates are currently seeing violations or predatory practices, what should they do about it? So the enterprises are not part of the tenant-landlord relationship. The enterprise's ability to support tenants themselves really is through information and relief offered to multifamily borrowers through forbearance. The main mechanism for enforcement would be tenants raising it as a defense when a landlord pursues eviction in local courts, or tenants suing landlords for damages related to improper evictions. The enterprises do investigate claims of unlawful eviction by contacting the loan servicer for each property and gathering information. Borrowers that fail to comply with applicable law may be subject to remedies under the loan documents, i.e. a technical default, and both enterprises have taken steps to address instances where there is an indication that a borrower has failed to follow the CARES Act eviction moratorium. FHFA will continue to work with the enterprises to monitor evictions and ensure properties are in compliance with the law. Now, one of the more challenging aspects within the multifamily rental market is a lack of information. So I know I mentioned, yeah.
If it's okay, if it's okay, I'd love to just stop you right there so we
Sure.
can dig a little bit more into the tenant protection RFI.
Yep.
We did get a lot of questions in the chat box. The RFI is not out yet, so there is no place for people to submit comments yet. But I just want to let folks know on this call that as soon as that RFI is announced, we're going to launch a weekly meeting for any of NLHC members or partners to join to help us as we put together our comment letter. And we'll have lots of resources for all of you so that you can engage your networks and make sure that as many people with lived experience, as many housing advocates as possible are weighing in. And I'm wondering, Siobhan, if you could just share with us, we do have a question from Jerry who asks, how is FHFA engaging with people with lived experience through that RFI? And how can all of us weigh in to make sure that those perspectives are at the table?
Sure, absolutely. So I think you kind of just talked about it. I mean, this RFI, knock on wood, is supposed to be published hopefully next week. We're kind of in our final processes right now and working on all of our sign-offs. But encouraging folks to really write in those comment letters. So I think we've been trying to put the word out about it. Every comment letter that is sent to FHFA, we do read. So I can guarantee whether it's coming from an individual tenant or if it's coming from a borrower, we will be reading those. We have also interacted with a lot of the different tenant advocacy groups, such as People's Action and Homes Guarantee for Rent. So I feel like on some of these other issues, we've already received direct letters. So really encouraging folks, it's going to be a 60-day comment period. So to go ahead and please send those in.
That's wonderful. 60 days. I'm going to take a note of that so that we all have ahead of us a game plan.
The time, yes.
For how we can make sure we're engaging and getting as many people to comment as possible. I'll ask you just one more question. You sort of hit on it, but for folks on the call who may not have ever submitted a public comment to a federal agency, can you share a little bit about how do those comments shape the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so a great question. You know, when you guys do see the RFI, there's going to be a laundry list of different questions. And so I think, you know, to the extent that we can actually hear real examples, that always helps us. So hearing examples of unlawful treatment or hearing examples from borrowers that, you know, success stories of tenant protections. I mean, those are the kind of things that we really want to hear. So if you guys have actual examples and can put that into writing, that really does help us inform our policy as we go forward. And like I said, we'll be reading every single letter. We're not rushing on this one. I think we understand this is a big change. Obviously, the director understands that as well. So any sort of changes that we do ultimately end up making, we want to make sure that the industry is ready for them and can accept them, and that we've talked to everybody and anyone on this topic.
Wonderful. Well, we so thank you for joining on and giving a preview to our partners and our members about how they can engage. And as I mentioned before, as soon as that RFI is out, we're going to let all of you guys on the call know about it so that you can start using our tools. We have sample comment letters, we'll have talking points, we'll have examples that you can pull from. But we really want to make sure that your voice is being heard and that you have a forum for submitting comments to FHFA. So Siobhan, thank you so much for joining with us.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. We're going to move along to a conversation about the threats that are facing affordable housing and homelessness programs and other anti-poverty programs. But I'm going to, before I turn it over to Peggy Bailey from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and Steve Berg from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, I'm just going to give a quick overview of where things are with negotiations because we're seeing those threats. They are very real. Negotiations over how and whether to lift the debt ceiling are underway right now. And I think it's really important for us to dig into a little bit more about what's at stake. And so I'll give my overview and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. And then later on at the end of the call, we'll hear from Kim from our team about ways that you can take action. So negotiations, like I said, between the White House and Speaker McCarthy have been gaining momentum. They were meeting over the weekend as well. Both sides are will need to reach an agreement by June 1st, which is when the Treasury Secretary says that we'll have a catastrophic default on the nation's debt. And it looks like there's been a lot of progress towards reaching a deal, still more ground to cover. But both sides are pretty optimistic that a deal could be cut very soon. And while I think it's clear we're not going to see the full extent of the budget cuts and other harmful provisions that House Republicans have been proposing in their negotiations, it does seem like we are increasingly likely to see a situation where work requirements could be added to low-income families who are receiving SNAP food assistance or TANF, maybe even Medicaid. We are likely to see some sort of provisions around rescinding unspent or unobligated COVID relief funding, including funding possibly for housing programs. And we're going to see some level of spending caps, at least for a couple of years, although the length of time is still under negotiations, with Democrats pushing for spending caps at 2 years, Republicans pushing for spending caps more along 2 to 10 years, which is very much like the Budget Control Act of 2011, which we saw 10 years of spending cuts come out of. Over the weekend, I think what gives me concern is that there has been reports that President Biden has proposed level funding for HUD for FY24, and that Republicans have rejected it because they are pushing for even deeper cuts to HUD programs and other domestic programs. So I think we had talked about before, Republicans are insisting that they cap funding at FY22 levels, but they also want to fund and give increases to defense programs. They want to give increases to the VA health program, which means that all of the cuts to HUD and other domestic programs could be even deeper. And just recently, the Office of Management and Budget has estimated that that could be about 30% cuts to HUD funding if Republicans achieve what they've been asking for, which we don't know just yet. So there's a very good chance that we're facing budget cuts this year. We just don't know by how much. They could reach a deal very soon, possibly in the next couple of days. So it's really critical that all of us are taking action as soon as possible. We'll hear from Kim, like I said, at the end of the call to walk us through what is it that we can be doing right now in this moment. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Peggy Bailey from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who's going to share more about what the impact would be if work requirements are added to those anti-poverty programs. I'll turn it over to you, Peggy.
Hi, thanks, Sarah, and hello, everybody. Sorry to be here on such a glum piece, but as Sarah said, there are threats across the board when it comes to programs for people with the lowest incomes. it's going to be really important to focus obviously on the housing, on the potential housing cuts, but we actually need to rally all together to protect health, food, and just general income for folks. So I'm going to walk through the threats to the Medicaid program, the temporary assistance for needy families or TANF program, and for food stamps. Know that all of this is in the work requirement standpoint. So overall, for all three programs, what the GOP bill would do is try to enforce stricter work requirements across the board. The other thing that's important to remember with the three programs is that Medicaid right now does not have work requirements except for in a few cases like Arkansas. And what Arkansas provides us is it shows us that work requirements only serve to kick people out of healthcare coverage. Other than that, they're not, that's really seems to be the point. So we're trying to protect work requirements from Medicaid overall. And then for food stamps and TANF, both have work requirements embedded in the programs to various degrees. And these proposals on the table would tighten them. So, so as I said, in Medicaid, there are the provisions would allow for work requirements. A few populations could be exempt. People under 19. People over 55, people with disabilities with an SSI and SSDI definition, which we know is problematic for many people, especially people experiencing homelessness. But overall, it would enforce the case, as I said, in Arkansas, where people could have coverage for 3 months of the year, but if they weren't working beyond that, that's it. They could only have 3 months of coverage over a 12-month period if they didn't work. And the president has said over and over that he intends to protect healthcare coverage for people. So we know Medicaid might be on safer ground, but still, we're concerned until a deal is done. When it comes to food stamps, what the bill proposes is to raise the age to 56. The age that work requirements are in effect to age 56. So that means people between the ages of 50 and 55 would now have to adhere to work requirements or face only 3 months of being able to have food assistance. And we think that would impact a little less than 1 million people. So, but about 900,000 people would be impacted by that. And then we get to the temporary assistance for needy families program. Now, TANF, as we all know, is extraordinarily complicated. The rules and how to get access to cash assistance are tough, and this bill would make it even tougher. In the states that still have cash assistance programs, it would pretty much end their cash assistance programs, because all of the ways that they figure out how to either meet the work requirement or get credits so that they don't have to meet their work requirement would be taken away. But one of the key pieces about the TANF proposal is it would not save any money. TANF is a block grant. So it's block grant. The states get a fixed amount of money, and they have some flexibility in how they decide to spend it. If these provisions went into place, states would have to end their cash assistance programs, but they wouldn't get money taken away. And so that's really concerning, because it could create more situations like what we saw in Mississippi with the Brett Favre scandal, where states have this money that has very little HHS oversight and is most definitely not getting cash assistance to families. We know that TANF has had its issues. It doesn't reach everyone that it needs to reach, but for the families that do get it, that cash means a lot. And this would, in effect, this could have the consequence of ending cash assistance to families. And so we need to protect against it. And I will say that you can tell from comments from the parties that are negotiating that TANF is one of them, is particularly vulnerable because it's just dwindled in reach over time. And we have to make sure folks understand the importance of this cash assistance has for families. So so that's pretty much the overview from the Medicaid, SNAP, and TANF side of the world. And now I'm going to pass it, I think, to Steve to talk about the appropriations pieces in particular.
All right, thanks, Peggy. Hi, I'm Steve Berg. I'm with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I just want to thank our friends from Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and from the National Low Income Housing Coalition and from all the different organizations that are on this call. We've got our work cut out for us here. And yet I feel we're going to be able to fight hard for what we need here. I want to talk for a few minutes about appropriations. That appropriations, for people who don't know, is the sort of technical term for the process that Congress goes through to determine how much money gets spent for certain classes of federal programs, including basically all the programs at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So appropriations includes how much money there is for Section 8, for homelessness programs, for the home program, for community development block grants. All of that is part of is determined by the appropriations process. So basically what we know about the appropriations process and these programs is that we need more money, not less money, for programs like the tenant-based rental assistance, the voucher program. We need more money, not less money, for homeless programs. The proposal that the House Republicans put out is a proposal that almost certainly will mean less money for those programs, not the more money that we need. The groups that sponsor this call have generally said that we need increases in programs for the coming year, like an increase to 3.833 billion for the homeless programs. That's an increase of $200 million a year. An increase up to $32.5 billion for tenant-based rental assistance to fund the Housing Choice Voucher Program. If the proposed spending cuts that the Republican majority have in their bill were to pass, HUD has estimated that tens of thousands of people would lose housing who would otherwise get it from those kind of programs and other programs at HUD. So this is what's at stake here. The usual appropriations process is that the leadership of the House and Senate agree on overall spending numbers for all the appropriation spending for the year, and then they go and cut it up by subcommittee. So there's 12 different subcommittees on the Appropriations Committee. They each deal with a certain number of federal agencies. The proposal that the House Republicans have put out would set the overall spending levels for several years, and the negotiations are going on over how low the cap would be on appropriations and for how many years those caps would be in place. What will not be determined by that process, at least not publicly, probably, is breaking them down into the various subcommittees. Some of the subcommittees in the House have gone ahead with proposals, with marking up their proposed subcommittee bills based on the overall spending level that the House Republicans put out. Those have provided big increases for programs like the Department of Veterans Affairs, increases for the Homeland Security Department. They have not come forward with what they propose to do to the HUD budget. So the fact that they, even in capping the overall program and still increasing spending for some of those other programs that are popular among that are traditionally receive benefits from the Republican side. It just means that the HUD programs would have to be cut even more. So it's very important as this goes on that we do what we can to keep the overall caps on spending as high as possible. And then once that's determined, then we're going to have to fight really hard to get the HUD bill, the bill that funds HUD, to have as high a level as possible so that we can escape some of these really brutal cuts to some of those programs. So let me stop there because I think people probably have questions, and then we can get on the rest of the program. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Peggy. We appreciate that. I do see some questions for you. I would love to ask either Peggy or Steve if you have an estimate, or what is the latest estimate on the number of households with rental assistance that would lose rental assistance if HUD's budget was capped at FY22 levels, and if those cuts to the rest of the domestic programs, like the defense programs, went forward, but HUD's budget was cut to make up for it. That wasn't English, but I'm sorry. But any, in terms of real numbers, what have you seen in terms of the impact?
So it depends on the numbers that actually we're about to put out a blog, I think, that explain, like literally like about to put out a blog that puts it out. So we've been kind of running the numbers up until like the point that the blog goes out to get clear on that. But it's definitely in the millions of households, because you can't just take into account the people who lose assistance today. You've got to look at the fact that at how this within the voucher program itself, it's also across the other HUD programs that we would expect that wouldn't be able to increase in order to be able to serve more households.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peggy. When you have that blog, we'll share it with folks. Steve, did you want to add on to that?
Just the scope of this is really incredible. I mean, we're always arguing for more voucher program resources because we know that only about a quarter of the people who are eligible actually receive a housing voucher, and that's one of the big reasons there's so many people homeless in this country. And this proposal, rather than doing more, is about doing less.
Absolutely. I did see a question from Stacy who's asking about how do we balance the need to be fiscally responsible, but also making sure that programs that are serving the lowest income people, that those aren't cut in the process.
So I'll take that one because that's one of our favorite questions here at the center, and that's and it's about raising revenues. If you look at the Bush, going all the way back to the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, if we hadn't made those decisions and the economy had grown at the rate that it's growing, we wouldn't be in the budget pickle that we are now. So we can't. So it is irresponsible to say that it is spending that is solely responsible for any deficits that we're seeing. We have cut revenues over and over and over again. That's now made the pool of resources available constrained. We've got to start making wealthy corporations and wealthy people start paying their fair share to contribute. And it's just ridiculous that we don't talk, that doesn't get talked about more. We talk about it a ton, but we got to talk about that more, that we have to be able to raise revenues. If folks go back to the Clinton administration, when Clinton handed off the economy to President Bush, we had very close to balanced budgets at that time. And in the last 20 years, particularly during the Republican administrations, we've lost that because of tax cuts, not because of spending.
Thank you, Peggy. And I think the other thing that we typically push back on is that work requirements also don't save money. You know, one of the things that Republicans often say is that there'll be somehow be savings for those programs, but the truth is that there are so many people who are in need of these resources that it really won't produce any savings. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that, Peggy and or Steve?
Sure. So, right, exactly right. Last week, Columbia University released a study that showed that for every dollar cut in cash assistance to families, we would spend $8 in social costs, either at the federal, state, or local level, in trying to help that family be able to stabilize in the housing and afford things and just be able to live. And so that right there shows us that this is not a real conversation about cuts. It is a conversation about about political philosophy of not helping people who need the help the most, and instead helping wealthy corporations and others get richer, rather than helping those who need help the most. And we also know, and even on a basic level, we know work requirements do not lead to better work. They don't take into account that people, first of all, the majority of people are working. Second, that they don't get to control how much money they make. So just because they're working doesn't mean that they're making enough to live. And third, there are plenty of people who are working, but not in paid activities. So they're either in childcare or caring for their own children, caring for a family member, trying to go to school, doing other things that they need to do for their long-term stability, but that could cause them to lose benefits. And I actually should add a fourth thing. Work requirements are really about setting up barriers to people to get access to help. It's not about actually like trying to help people do better or work or anything. And they're really about setting up barriers, and they use work requirements instead of as a euphemism for the racism and discrimination that they're carrying forward, of thinking that people of color, Black people in particular, are not working, are lazy, and leaning into those tropes that we know are false. That looking back at at how these programs have started, slavery was work. We worked for a really long time. We generally, people without incomes are working, or with low incomes are working harder than everyone else, and are definitely working hard. And the idea that people are not working is ludicrous.
Thank you, Peggy and Steve. I just wanted to say that while they're working towards reaching an agreement, and they are working very quickly to try to reach one as soon as possible, it doesn't mean that there isn't time for your voice to be heard. It is really important that as soon as you get off the Zoom call today, that you call your members of Congress, you engage with them, you write them emails, because we need as much pressure on them as possible to push back on any sort of cuts to housing programs, to other domestic programs, to these work requirements. It's incredibly important. So I don't want you to give up hope, but we're going to put that on pause for a second. We'll come back to Kim at the end of the call, who can tell us about how we can take action. But just to flag for everybody on this call how incredibly important it is to do something today and tomorrow and until they reach a deal. So Peggy and Steve, thank you so much for joining with us. We always appreciate your work on these issues.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And now we are going to pivot the conversation to some recent events in New York City. We're going to hear from Amanda Jack from the Legal Aid Society of New York City about some threats from their mayor that's focused on increasing the criminalization of people experiencing homelessness and forced hospitalization. So thank you so much for joining us, Amanda.
Thank you for having me, Sarah. And it's really a pleasure to be here. As Sarah said, I'm a criminal defense public defender. So I've just been learning a lot in this call. And I just thank you all for your advocacy and work across the country. It's wonderful to be in your company. And thanks for having me here. I work at the Legal Aid Society in New York. We work in all 5 boroughs, and we also have a really large and effective civil practice, including our Homeless Rights Project and all of the amazing housing attorneys in our civil practice. I am not one of those people, so that's not my level of expertise. But of course, the criminalization of folks who are experiencing homelessness is something that is a decades long, more than that, experience. So as a public defender for the last 12 years, I have certainly represented many, many people who have been swept off from the streets and who, of course, have been provided no meaningful services other than incarceration at Rikers Island. So I'm happy to be here. I was asked to come and speak about a recent letter that we all across the 5 boroughs, all the public defender organizations released in response to our mayor's continued efforts to criminalize homelessness and especially to involuntarily hospitalize people too. Of course, we know the crossover of folks, at least here in the city, who might be experiencing homelessness and mental illness. It's a big crossover section. I'll briefly just give a quick little history of the last 2 years. Mayor Adams was inaugurated in 2022, but of course, as across the country, pandemic, post-pandemic, New York NYC as a large city has been struggling to kind of repopulate its work centers, and especially in the city of Manhattan. And of course, no meaningful funding has been increased to actually put people into homes, even though we have all these empty office spaces and empty apartment buildings and, pied-à-terres where people don't actually live. That's what I think is actually criminal. So we started seeing when Adams came into office, a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric about cleaning up the streets, getting people back to work, making the subways safe. The subways were safe. But we are also experiencing, as around the country, because of the pandemic and the lack of resources and lack of economic opportunity, there were some more high profile allegations of criminal behavior on our subways and our streets, and usually associated with, we'd come to find later, with the person who was alleged to be the attacker was experiencing some kind of mental illness, some kind of crisis. So he began, the statement that I'm here to talk about was one that we issued a couple weeks ago, but it was really in response to something that he had done last year. Leading up to last year, I will also just state that one of the things that happened during the early pandemic as public defenders across the country, I know, and especially here at the Legal Aid Society, we were writing writs to get people out of jail. We were doing everything we could early on because, of course, COVID was spreading in places where, enclosed spaces where people didn't have access to their own, private space or filtration. And this was, of course, jail settings and prison settings. And so we worked to really move people out. And one of the things the city did was it repurposed the hotels, which are now sitting empty, with federal funding to use them as rapid reentry sites. And they also staffed them with programmatic resources, including medical staff. And this was incredible. We had people who were returning home from prison sentences who maybe we got an early release for, and certainly people who were sitting at Rikers, which is a jail, right? So it's where people sit charged of crimes, too poor to be able to afford their bail. So we were getting folks out that way. We were, petitioning the court and the judges and saying we have a place for people to go. Because obviously, if you're sitting at Rikers because you can't afford your bail, it's also very likely that you don't have stable housing. So these reentry hotels were amazing. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people cycled through. We kept hearing the threat of them closing. They kept staying open. Of course, last year, Mayor Adams finally stopped funding them, and they began closing with about 30 days notice. And so we rallied together with housing advocates here in the city. We did everything we could to try to keep them open, with the exception of one. We really failed. There's a promise that they're going to reinstate that kind of rapid reentry where you don't have to wait for months and months and months on a wait list, but it's something where there is a place to be in a single room, not, a room with like 20 beds, but like a hotel room type situation where you have your own bed, you have your own bathroom, and you have access to services on site. Okay, so that was one thing that was getting defunded. These hotels were shutting down, creating a problem because there was no plan, for people to go. So a lot of folks just ended up without any place to go, without like a workable plan to make sure they kept up with any kinds of treatment options that they had voluntarily entered. Also last year, our mayor started doing sweeps of homeless encampments across the city. Some of them were just most of them were so violent where the police came in and just with garbage trucks and began just taking away all the tents, all the belongings, giving no notice, and then trying to force people into shelters. The final count was over 2,000 of these of people's spaces were removed, were swept up, and only about 115 actually went into our shelter system. Our shelter system is horrible. I have represented many people who feel safer in the streets than the shelter. I've also represented people who come out of the shelter with really serious injuries. There's fights all the time. It's completely underfunded, understaffed. And it's no surprise that people don't want to go into the New York City shelter system. So these homeless sweeps are happening, and we're also starting to receive an influx of migrants into New York City. And so there's a lot going on there where the mayor is talking about trying to take away some of our right to shelter laws, which is families should have their own private place, trying to house families, like warehouse migrants too. It's just getting increasingly bad. And then in November, there was another string of New York Post headlines and alleged attacks on the New York City subway. And the statement that we released last week was really one very similar to one we'd released in the fall, when the mayor made in November of last year, created a new city directive to involuntarily hospitalize people that were found living on the streets. Of course, the law, I think, which is similar in most places, is that if someone presents a serious harm of injury to themselves or others, then they can be involuntarily hospitalized with all of the legal protections built into it. So you would get a lawyer to challenge that involuntary hospitalization, if it was to continue after 48 hours. So that's long been the law. Some of that got expanded there's also a law in New York called Kendra's Law, which is mandated outpatient treatment. So there's, these things have been in the ether, but what Adams did in November is this city directive he issued was to all city agencies, telling them to transport people with mental illness to hospitals. And it was whether or not they wanted it. And some of the reasons why were if they, what was it? If they couldn't, this is amazing. He said that one of the ways to determine if they should be transported to the hospital was whether or not they were able to provide the basics to themselves, such as food, shelter, and healthcare, which is, again, just so outrageous, right? Like, here is the mayor of the largest city in the US who has refused to actually, put the resources of money and people resources and infrastructure into these kinds of services, saying that if you can't get yourself food, shelter, or healthcare, then you should be involuntarily hospitalized. How this is shaked out, it's really hard to have a sense of numbers going forward. I don't think it has had an effect. Obviously, city workers have been doing this, but his proposal was very much illegal in nature. So those kind of complaints were quickly made too. And we've continued to fight back. And then, of course, was it a month ago now, Daniel Perry, a white ex-Marine, was on the subway and murdered Jordan Neely, who is someone who had been a client of legal aid in the past, and who was someone who was experiencing a crisis. But the initial reporting was so imbued with racist tropes and scare tactics and splashy tabloid headlines that we know now wasn't true. And it was an incredible tragedy, this murder of Mr. Neely. And so in the wake of that, our mayor and our governor couldn't bring themselves to call it what it was, which was a murder, and so kind of danced around it. And he once again talked about this directive to put people involuntarily into the hospitals. So that's where the statement that thank you to whomever posted it, I appreciate that. And that's when we once again kind of just re-upped what we had said earlier, just really condemning this kind of directive, this kind of behavior, calling it out for the racism that it does encapsulate by trying to do this, and also the fact that it really does just distract from the actual policies and investments that would actually address the root causes of these issues. So I'll share that. I also share that I think one of the things that as a public defender, and I don't want to speak for all public defenders, but I think something that can be a challenge and a struggle is that oftentimes criminal defense public defenders like myself think, well, if someone is in a mental health crisis, I'd rather they'd be better off in the hospital than the jail. And I think with the evolution of that thought has been in working with, other colleagues and impacted leaders and family members, has been coming to the realization that involuntary hospitalization, forced treatment, is no better than jail, and is just jail by another name. And I think that's what we're always trying to respond to. And so I think the challenge for us going forward and in all these spaces is to try to always think of that and not just like be boxed off into the criminal defense view of things, which is always to get people out of jail, get people out of prison, keep people in their communities, and to really force any kind of treatment that comes through the courts, make it, advocate for it to be voluntarily entered, advocate for it to be community-based, and advocate for people to stay in communities with services that will actually, be the ones that will help them to stay out of the arms of the long arms of the police. So that's, I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions. It's kind of a lot and very region specific. So
No, I
I'll pause
appreciate it.
there.
I appreciate your sharing this, Amanda, because on this call and in other forums, we've been talking a lot about how we're seeing more and more elected officials move away from things that work to end homelessness, like affordable housing, like services, and instead are embracing this anti-homeless rhetoric and are taking up criminalization efforts. So it's really well timed. We're glad you're able to share with us today. And I'm wondering, and the other thing I'll mention is that it's not just in Republican states where we're seeing increased criminalization. It's also in places like New York City, blue cities. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for advocates who might be on this call who either are dealing with criminalization efforts in their communities or think that it might be coming to them. What advice do you have for them as they're pushing back on these harmful proposals?
Yeah, I think, and I don't, I'm doing this policy work now, but I'm by no means an expert. I think it's really that connecting up with the public defenders in your communities as well. And I think I know that different offices are at different moments of like, abolitionist vision or just, community engagement. But I think that one of the things that is really clear is that even if the public defenders in your area only have criminal defense attorneys, right? They're still seeing this cross section of, issues of mental illness, issues of homelessness. I mean, all of the things are crossing over, and the reason why most likely the low income person they represent is in front of them, is in front of the court. And I think that like we have a really amazing homeless rights project at Legal Aid that works really closely as counsel to Coalition for the Homeless. And I just am always reaching out to them and to my colleagues in the housing unit at Civil because they have those community ties as well, to make sure that we're not just kind of too myopically focused on like the criminal charges, right? And somehow doing harm in the other ways. So I think my hope would be that there would be more of this crossbreeding between people like me in the public defender sphere and the criminal court sphere and folks like you all who do this incredible advocacy across the country. And I think that can be more difficult and maybe easier in some places, but I think until we can really link up and make it really clear that so much of the folks that are accused of crimes, especially the low income folks, that they're the people that are also at the intersection of all these other issues and are not receiving services. And until we really stop seeing policing and jailing as the only solution, right? Until we can end that, we're never going to get the buy-in to actually increase the money and funding and services and focus on all the issues that you all know will solve the problems that you're working on.
Thank you so much for joining, Amanda. I see there's a question in the Q&A box, but we don't have time to get to it. If you're able to stay on and answer that we'd love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll also just make a pitch for folks if you want to do more and learn more about this growing threat of criminalization and other harms to people experiencing homelessness. You can participate in our Homelessness and Housing First webinar series. It's a monthly series. Thank you to Elena for sharing it in the chat box. And we're going to continue to hold those webinars to really dig in much more deeply into how we can all be pushing back on these harmful narratives and measures. So thank you so much, Amanda.
Yes,
for
of course, my pleasure.
Okay, and now we are going to turn to Kendra Naden from Idaho Asset Building Network, who's going to give us an update from Idaho. But I'm going to ask if we can turn the slide to the next one. Okay. Thanks, Kendra.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And hello, everybody. It's very exciting to be able to join you all today. Like Sarah said, my name is Kendra Knighton, and I am a policy associate with the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy and the Idaho Asset Building Network. And in the face of a lot of really significant challenges in the housing policy landscape, again, I'm just very honored to be able to join you all today to share some successes that we've had at the state level this year. So during this latest legislative session, the Idaho Asset Building Network worked very closely with other industry folks and advocates and lawmakers in Idaho to successfully enhance renter protections here in Idaho. And that was done through the passage of Senate Bill 1039. This is a bill that was a project of Senator Ali Rabi, who also works in eviction prevention in Ada County. And this is a bill that she actually introduced 2 years ago, but was unable to get enough support to have it passed within a reason, or to have it pass that legislative session. I'm so sorry. Let me close the door. I'm so sorry about that. So essentially what this bill did is it would require that all fees in Idaho be reasonable for rental agreements. Because Idaho has definitely, seen the same patterns that other states have seen, where we have seen rapidly increasing rental prices, a significant shortage of affordable homes, and all that has just been compounded by the effects of the pandemic. So as a result of that, we've also seen landlords, kind of taking advantage of renters through the use of unreasonable fees that have been putting many renters at risk of eviction. So this bill would have required that all fees be reasonable, that they be enumerated within a written lease agreement when a written lease agreement was present. It would require a landlord to provide 30 days notice for any change to that agreement. And it would prohibit landlords from collecting fees in excess of what was included in the lease agreement. So we initially started this legislation in the Senate, where the sponsor, has a seat, and the, that senator and our organization worked pretty closely with lawmakers to gain support for this bill. And we were very excited to see it pass the Senate, but we knew that the House would be a challenge. And when we went to the House, we also ended up having that bill assigned to a committee that we knew would be very difficult for us. So with all hands on deck, we reached out to members of that committee. We asked them for their support, and we knew walking into that committee hearing that day that we had that bill approved by only one vote. But when we showed up to have the actual hearing, there were 2 of our yes votes that actually had to stand up and leave because they had to go to another committee. And so we were, freaking out a little bit that all the work that we had done would be undone by just a scheduling issue. But we stayed, we gave testimony, and there was one testimony in particular from a program manager at a local eviction prevention program, where he stood up and he gave an example of an unreasonable fee that one of their clients had experienced. And the story he told was about a child who had been outside, found a praying mantis, put it in a jar, and brought it home, like children do. But the landlord found out about it and assessed that family a pet fee, which most people would agree is unreasonable. And that single story completely switched the tone of that hearing, and the bill ended up passing that hearing with only one vote in opposition, and then eventually passed the full House and was signed into law by the governor. But we really just love to share this story as a great example of how impactful these stories of impacted individuals are, and how important just even one voice can be during these discussions. So we are now very excited to see some enhanced consumer protections for renters here in Idaho, and hope to be able to continue building on that in the future. But my email address is there if anybody has any questions or wants to connect following this, and I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Kendra. Oh my goodness, what like a high stakes drama that hearing must have been. Sounds like it's prime for a made for TV movie. But I think that's a really good example to focus on the call about how like just one really clear, egregious example can help reframe sort of how policymakers are thinking about the issue. I'm wondering, were there any other, I'm not sure if your state legislature, what like the divide is between Republicans and Democrats, but if you could share a little bit about what were the messages that seemed to get across to both parties in your legislature?
Thank you for asking that. And I apologize, I meant to cover that, but the doorbell ringing and my dog barking really threw me off. Yeah, so Idaho is a very conservative state, and that is reflected in our legislature. We have a super majority of Republicans in both chambers. So we definitely are, trying to engage in our lawmakers in a way that appeals to them. And something that's been really effective for us is, really just finding those shared values and building upon that. we spoke a lot about the concerns that folks have had with renting and, giving examples of unreasonable fees. And we were able to reach a lot of lawmakers through those conversations. So just really building upon that, showing some of the unfairness that renters have experienced was pretty helpful. And also just tying it to, their own values and their own experiences as Idahoans living in our state.
That is awesome. And I hope it gives some hope to folks who are in more conservative leaning places that they can still achieve really great renter protection legislation. I see a question, one more question from Jerry, who asks, how do you and your colleagues elevate common values and organize further for more progressive policies in Idaho? How do you take it to the next step where you can?
Yeah, so something that also has been very effective beyond just finding those shared values and finding ways to kind of bridge that gap is, finding shared language. And I think for a lot of us, data is often a shared language that is something that appeals to both sides. The National Income Housing Coalition shares a lot of data with us about what's happening at the state level. And we have other partners who are also doing that type of analysis. And so we can bring those stories forward. We can bring examples of how beneficial housing is. But then we also have the data to back it up, and we can show them this is your district and these are the challenges people in your district are experiencing. So I'd say that data has also been an incredibly helpful thing in those conversations as well.
Thank you, Kendra. That was a plug for our Out of Reach report, which is coming out in June, but the check is in the mail. Thank you so much, Kendra, for joining with us. I am going to turn now to our next field update, which is from Stacy Berger from Housing and Community Development Network of New Jersey. Stacy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to the rest of the presenters who've been with us. I was both sad and excited to hear what's happening at the federal level, especially from Peggy Bailey, who just really hit the nail on the head there a whole lot. We've been working hard here in New Jersey to make sure that our entire New Jersey delegation understands the threat that the congressional Republican proposal around the debt ceiling would have to our voucher holders and our housing market in general, as well as to low-income people and people with disabilities and families struggling to get by. I struggle with trying to understand how people could be so mean to other people. Literally while we were on the Zoom, I got a call from a neighbor who's helping a woman who's 71 years old who paid what she could afford of her rent because it went up, and now she's facing eviction and will become homeless. So it is really a problem everywhere. New Jersey has some of the toughest, best tenant protections in the nation, of which we're very proud and protective. But that doesn't mean that we, by any means, any stretch of the imagination, have really solved these problems. We have language that prevents an unconscionable rent increase, and it is up to a judge to decide what that means. And we are going to go to the legislature and ask for a definition of an unconscionable rent increase. I think we could all agree that it would be unconscionable to charge a family a pet fee for a bug in a jar. This is sort of a gray zone where it's not really clear what the dollar amounts are, what the percentages are, but we're seeing rent increases between 18 and 30, sometimes as high as 40% around the state of New Jersey, which if you've been here for 5 minutes, is extremely expensive and very difficult to find an affordable rental home. Out of Reach comes out on June 14th, but I can tell you that New Jersey has been among the top 7 or 8 states in that report for the entire time that I've been at the network, which is going on 18 years. So somebody has to be at the top, but it's not a place that we want to stay or remain. So we are working hard as a network of 270 community development corporations, private sector partners, and housing champions to get those increases under control and to protect people from both those unconscionable and just predatory pricing changes. We've also seen a huge uptick in corporate developers, corporations, really LLCs, buying single family and small multifamily homes in some of our urban centers, which then has the double whammy of taking those homes that had been sort of market rate affordable and pricing them out of people's reach, and also very severely restricting the ability of folks in the neighborhood who've lived there and grown up there and want to buy a home where they grew up to purchase an affordable place to live and build generational wealth. So we are looking at ways to restrict and counter the move by those for-profit entities that are taking homes out of people's reach. I wanted to share just briefly the op-ed that we did with our board president, but I do want to send it to everybody in the chat. So let me see if I can do that here. I can, I think. There we go. I believe I sent that to everyone. Yep, that's my board chair and myself issued that release last week with a lot of help from our tremendous comms team at the NLHC, at the coalition, as well as locally here in our state. And we've now had a few editorial board invitations and some calls from some congressional offices looking for more info. And we're working with the Cracker Jack staff at the coalition to identify a few key folks at the congressional delegation level to meet with and make sure that they have all the information that they need to fight as vociferously as they can to stop a bad deal. In the very beginning, we were talking about making sure that our voices were heard prior to a deal being done. But I think it's really important that even to note that just because a deal is announced doesn't even necessarily mean a deal is complete, because we know that we have seen the Republicans and some really, very difficult people to work with, a whole lot of deals. At least here in New Jersey, we have seen deals be announced and then deals be undone by people unwilling to go along. So we are not interested in a deal that hurts people and takes millions of people off of the social safety net that they need. So I would echo what Sarah said, which is to keep calling and writing and emailing and texting and whatever else we need to do. We should, we will do to try to stop the congressional, from a very small number of congressional Republicans, from torpedoing our entire economy and the future and well-being of everyone else. We are also working on a few pieces of legislation as we gear up for our legislative season ends June 30th. It's tied to the budget. If you remember a few years back, you may have seen that picture of Chris Christie, who we hear is going to announce a presidential run. But he closed the state of New Jersey because they couldn't do a budget deal. And even though they had announced a budget deal and they couldn't actually get the budget deal done, he went and sat on the beach in a beach chair. You've probably seen the meme. That is what we have here in New Jersey when that happens. We close the state if we can't do a budget deal. So the end of June gets very hectic. We are looking to adopt a code red policy so that matches our code blue policy, so people without permanent shelter have a safe place to go when it's either too hot, too cold, or there's a climate disaster, all of which we've seen in New Jersey with increasing regularity and severity. We are looking to identify what unconscionable means in that rent increase language in our current state statute. And just last week, we succeeded in identifying resources for mental health services to be allowed to be provided in shelters. The conversation we were having before about shelters and they're being unsafe and scary places for people who are already suffering tremendously. In New Jersey, we don't have the resources or the permission actually to provide mental health services in shelters up until last week, when the governor signed a bill that the network and our allies and partners have been working on. And last but not least, we are continuing to fight for eviction prevention and diversion resources. Jersey City, which is the second largest city here in the Garden State, is on the precipice of adopting a right to counsel bill funded by developer fees through large multifamily developers. And we are supporting that very strongly and look forward to it becoming law very, very soon. So that would add two cities in the state of New Jersey with right to counsel, both our largest city, the city of Newark, and the city of Jersey City. And then our Department of Community Affairs also has an access to counsel pilot program, which is ongoing in 4 other municipalities. And we expect it will be, or hope anyway, that it will be expanded in the coming months and years. We know that eviction diversion works. And we know that providing small amounts of money for emergency rental crises, helps keep people safely and stably housed. And so if there's additional funding in the budget, which we actually have some funding from ARP that has not yet been spent, that is an area that we would like to see dedicated. If we're going to spend money on anything, we want to make sure it gets spent on people and not on huge tax breaks for wealthy corporations and individuals. We are currently fighting a simultaneous battle at the federal level, here at the state level, where we have $1 billion corporate business tax surcharge, which is assessed on profits over $1 million. That has been, there was sort of a handshake agreement in 2018 that it would sunset, and it's due to sunset now. And so we're going to lose $1 billion out of our budget unless we change those terms. And so we are pushing along with many, many, many other organizations who are doing incredible, tremendous work to keep that $1 billion, because we just found out last week, but there's also will be a shortfall of $2 billion. So why on earth we would give $1 billion away when we are going to be short $2 billion? Math is real, doesn't make much sense to do that. And so we're fighting really hard to keep those funds where people need them, including in emergency rental assistance. I think that's everything for what we're doing here. Yeah, I'm not going to watch that the Beach Christie video that someone just put in the chat, because I've seen that meme just one too many times. But I appreciate it and happy to take questions if there are any, or I can put my contact info in the chat in case anybody has questions later on.
Thank you, Stacy. I don't see any questions just yet, but I will just say that Stacy's one of the best advocates out there. So there's a lot to learn from her, and just really appreciate you joining on the call today. All right, then we will move on to our last part of the call. I mentioned earlier that it's really important that people take action, and now Kim is going to tell you all that you need to know so that you can do that. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah, and hi, everyone. I'm Kim Johnson, Policy Manager at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and Peggy, Steve, and Sarah really covered today's policy update. But I did want to join to share ways that advocates can continue getting involved and keep on weighing in with their members of Congress and the White House in order to drive home the necessity of increased funding for HUD's affordable housing and homelessness programs. So before I jump into that, I want to start out by saying thank you to everyone who participated in NLIHC's Spring into Action campaign. We had over 550 emails, phone calls, and tweets all sent to members of Congress, urging them not to make drastic cuts, or not to cut at all, HUD's affordable housing and homelessness resources. Thank you all so much for your advocacy. We cannot do this work without you. So we're really encouraging folks to build on that momentum during this important threat, this urgent threat that we talked about earlier. So there are, of course, potentially millions of vouchers and the housing stability for countless Americans hanging in the balance of the decisions that are being made. Next slide. There we go. So we are urging advocates to keep up the work. We know that the more that members hear from you, the more they understand the drastic impact of what they're talking about and what they're proposing. The budget isn't just a numbers game, right? It has real consequences for people. It has real impacts on communities. It is not simply a matter of cutting money and balancing the numbers. When we cut funding drastically from affordable housing and homelessness assistance, real people suffer. And so folks can use NLIHC's Legislative Action Center, which you can access by scanning the QR code on your screen with your phone or going to the link on your screen to call, email, and tweet your members of Congress. Advocates have a vital role to play, and I think that it was really driven home from all of the field updates that we heard, as well as the advocacy that was happening in New York, and from what Peggy, Steve, and Sarah had to say. The role of advocates in making the realities and consequences of these funding decisions real is so crucial. Tell them how those proposed budget cuts would impact your family, your friends, your neighbors, your communities. How would your communities absorb the loss of federal funding? Can they absorb the loss of federal funding? What happens when suddenly people experiencing homelessness are no longer able to access resources and supports that they need? Or when people with the lowest income suddenly lose assistance, the housing assistance they've been relying on for safe, stable housing. Tell them how this would impact you, because that is really the most important thing that they can hear right now, is understanding the real lived effect of the decisions that they're making. So yeah, please do keep weighing in, keep up the hard work, and thank you all so much for your support and your advocacy. Sarah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Kim. We have just a few minutes, so I'm gonna end our call here, but we're gonna leave up the screen. We're gonna leave up this QR code so that people can use the last 5 minutes of our call to take action. You don't even have to squeeze it into your already overscheduled schedule. You can do it right now. And then just want to thank everybody for joining our call today, and we'll see you soon. We'll keep you updated with what's happening here in Washington, D.C. Thanks, everybody. If we put it back on the QR code, that'd be great. Okay. Thank you.